is Chuck Berry, and Chuck Berry kind of wraps up that he's a final rock and roll icon or star on the timeline as far as the rock and roll sound. We'll talk about a little bit about rock minimally. I think maybe we have one rock artist on the timeline, but Chuck Berry really closes out the rock and roll era, at least as the timeline goes. And he was he was known for being a guitar innovator, and he was also a great songwriter. He's originally from St. Louis, and one of the early events that shaped his life is in 1944, his friends decided to go on a cross-country road trip to California. And while they're on the trip, they started to run low on money, and somehow they got to this idea where the way they were going to get money was to rob these local businesses, and it didn't work out, and they were all arrested and they were given 10-year sentences, and he was sent to a reformatory kind of like juvenile prison school situation. It's kind of similar to James Brown, we'll talk about later on in the episode. And during this time, he was when he focused more on music. Up until that point, he'd been doing some. I mean, he was young, so he was doing some odd jobs. He didn't really get much schooling, and he ended up serving 3 years there. But while he was there, he also started a quartet. As I just said, he was focused a little bit more on music, so that was part of that, and he was able to sing at services at the reformatory school, the chapel there for the the people or inmates who were there. And then after that, he briefly went to night school where he trained as a hairstylist, among other things. He did some other odd jobs during that time before really getting into professional music. And by 1942, he joined the Sir John Trio. And that was really his first, that was his first band and first experience and performance and, official formal experience in the music profession. His big influence that he named was Tbone Walker, which, as a guitarist, you can certainly understand that. In our episode, we talked about how, Tbone Walker was such a prolific guitarist, and when you look back over that period of time, he certainly maybe at the top, if not the most influential guitarist as far as the electric guitar, and where he took that and how it carries and stands up, in modern guitar work. But the way that Chuck Berry approached it was a little bit differently, and he focused more on rhythm, where Tbone Walker was known for his riffs, that solo lead work, a lot of focus on the single string, where Chuck Berry was, much more about, chord structure, focused a lot about rhythm. And, when you listen to his music, even when he, has his little, his brief solo work, he is very chord oriented. It's not the same as Tbone Walker, or even when you think about the guitarists from the later era, and you think about lead work and solo work, a lot of it is more of what you would think about with a traditional solo, as far as a lot of single string work and less emphasis on rhythm. And so that really kind of sets him apart. And of course, it's also guitar of the time. He's preceding. Tbone Walker is certainly ahead of his time. And you think of some of the other people like B.B. King, who's on our timeline, as far as these type of guitarists who are really doing that type of solo work and really, transforming what was the acoustic blues to the electric blues, but even more so kind of shaping the rock guitar that would come later, and Chuck Berry is kind of shaping a whole different aspect of that. So, it's not necessarily that he was intentionally shifting away from this. I think at the time, the electric guitar itself was still, people were still working out new ways. There wasn't a right way to do it. People were still experimenting and, learning different ways. As far as his influences, when you think of, Tbone Walker, there was, very limited selection as far as guitarists who were doing what he was doing at the time with the electric guitar specifically. As far as his lyrical style, he named Louis Jordan as a big influence, and that makes sense. Once again, when you talk about standouts similar to Tbone Walker, you think of Louis Jordan, who still, his band, of course, as we talked about, still holds quite a few hit records. Even to this day, he holds some charting records. And so, his performance style, we talked about his stage presence, and, his delivery was, definitely, probably the most recognized at the time. And all these other contributions that him and his band made as far as their approach to music and their versatility. And then in 1955, he got his first record. He had met Muddy Waters, and Muddy Waters had heard some of his music, and he connected him with Chess Records. And the first song that he had played for the people at Chess Records was a cover of Ida Red, and they ended up renaming that to Maybelline, which is Chuck Berry's first hit. And it's one of those songs that is on the list for one of those early rock and roll hits. And in 1956, he released another song, Roll Over Beethoven, which was part of the After School album, which is the album that is listed on the timeline. And that was an even bigger hit. And, Chuck Berry had a number of hits, but a lot of his songs, even included on the After School Session album, which is on the timeline, a lot of his songs were not, they didn't chart, they weren't, considered successful. And the reason that the album is on the timeline and not an individual song or songs is just because, Chuck Berry's music may not have charted, but as we'll see, later on, his music was really influential, and all these artists who were coming up, these young artists, were clearly listening to not only his hits, but were going through his albums and utilizing that to innovate and emulate, Chuck Berry's style and influence their music. So in Chuck Berry's case, he did have some big hits, but his most important contribution was really his actual innovation on guitar and his style, more so than individual songs. So that's why that's set up that way. And the other component, of course, of Chuck Berry is his live performance. His sporadic hits, were he had a good amount of success from that. But as we just said, a lot of them it was hit and miss, but all of that was made up for with his live performances, and people would just come to see him just for that. He was known for, his flamboyance and stage presence. He was on to all the guitar tricks that, we've talked about with some previous guys like Tbone Walker and Charlie Patton going way back. And so that really, put him to that next level and brought him into the circle of these other rock and roll stars who were coming on, just like Little Richard, who was also an not only incredible performer, but innovator in the rock and roll genre. And so, like Laverne Baker, he appeared on a lot of Alan Freed's All Star shows and rock films.